which we will think about the humanities and how we can think with the humanities and use the humanities to help us interpret our lives in this, I would say, absolutely fascinating but often difficult historical moment we're living through. My name is Christopher Celenza. I'm the Dean of Georgetown College at Georgetown University. And I'm so pleased that you're here with us. To our audience, what I'd like to say is we would like to have this be a conversation. So the first part will be a conversation among me and our panelists, whom we'll introduce in a moment. But really, we want this to be a chance for you too, to voice concerns you have, to ask questions about anything that comes up in this conversation. So if this is the first time that you've used this format, you'll notice there's a Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. Please submit those questions. We'll have about 25 minutes of us talking with each other, and then we'll open the conversation up to you. And again, we're so glad you're all here. As to me, I have to say that I'm not just delighted, I'm honored by the fact that I'm joined by 4 of our most outstanding scholars and our best teachers. Each of our panelists has published numerous books and articles in their fields. Each has found ways to reach out beyond their field, and each is a very wonderful teacher in our Georgetown College and at Georgetown University. So what I'm going to do is ask our panelists first, before we introduce our topic, just to introduce themselves. And I'll ask if we can do this in alphabetical order. So Cóilín, I'll start with you.
Hi everyone, good afternoon. I'm Cóilín Parsons. I'm an associate professor in the English department where I teach 20th century literature, and I'm delighted to be here.
Thank you. And then Nicoletta, I'll move to you.
Hi everybody, Nicoletta Pireddu, professor of Italian and core member of the Comparative Literature Program and the inaugural director of the Humanities Initiative. Thank
you. And I guess Andrew, that means you're next.
Hi, good evening, everybody. I'm Andrew Sobanet. I'm a professor in the Department of French and Francophone Studies. I'm delighted to be here.
And finally, Karen.
Hi, I'm Karen Stohr. I'm an associate professor in the philosophy department and also in the Kennedy Institute of Ethics. And I do, as you might guess, ethics.
Right. Well, first of all, welcome to all the panelists. Thanks for being with us. You know, in our world, the Georgetown College is also called the College of Arts and Sciences. So we span a lot of different fields: the natural sciences, the social sciences, the fine arts, and of course the humanities. And the one thing that all of those fields have in common is that their participants are engaged at the very basic matter of what they're doing in the search for truth. But they search for truth in different ways. And I think the humanities have their own ways of searching for truth. And especially as today, when we want to try to think about the worlds of literature and the worlds of philosophy and how those can help us think with and think through a kind of a crisis moment such as we're living through today, I think it's important for all of us, the audience, we as panelists, we as thinkers, to consider how the different forms of truth manifest themselves in the humanities. Certainly, they manifest themselves through exemplary experiences. We read literature, and even though we know in our new media economy in which we live, in which there's information coming at us from all sides at all times, we know that reading a novel can introduce us to other people that we never knew. We get a kind of a truth of human experience, even if it's not a truth in the sense of a documentary depiction of somebody, or an archival type of a date or something like that. So we know that the humanities really can be very profound. They can teach us empathy for people who are different from us. And oftentimes, I think in times of crisis especially, they can teach us to reach out to the world in ways that are new and different, especially when, I would say especially when we are in unforeseen circumstances such as the ones that we're in now. So what we wanted to do today is we wanted to kick off our discussion with a work of literature and philosophy that some of us in the audience may have seen in the news recently over the last month or two. And this is a novel called The Plague by the French author and philosopher Albert Camus. It's known as La Peste in French. And what I'd like to do first is I'd like to just turn to Andrew Sobanet, who has taught this work many times, who is an expert both in this field and actually in this time in French history, French literary history. And Andrew, what if we talk just a little bit about, you know, just let's get an overview for all the folks who may not have read it or read it recently. You know, who was Camus? You know, what was the plague? What are the kind of themes it addresses? When was it written? You know, you're the expert. Tell us what you think we need to know.
I'll do my best. So thank you, Chris. So readers have long looked to Camus for generations now for existential and moral guidance. And so why is that the case? Why is Camus seen as sort of an ethical guide for so many people? And one of the reasons for this is because across all of his entire body of work is there's a basic belief in the strength of the human spirit that comes forth. So he has sort of an inspiring vision, and one that it feels very comfortable to look to him for when we are living through catastrophes or crises. And in many ways, it's because he himself lived through an incredibly difficult period in the 20th century, sort of the mid-century generation. He was raised in poverty in colonial Algeria. He was born in 1913. His father was killed the following year in the very first significant battle of the Great War. He was raised by an illiterate mother. He contracted tuberculosis at age 17, and there was not a cure for it at that time. So he suffered, you know, bouts of it over the course of his entire life. During the Nazi occupation of France, where he was for a time, he worked in a resistance network, risking his life, helping publish a very important clandestine newspaper by the name of Combat, which was named after the network that was allied with General de Gaulle. And through all of this, he persevered and he thrived. And he was a brilliant student as a young man. He had a brilliant career. He won the Nobel Prize at age 43. He was the second youngest person to win it at that time. And coming out of the Second World War, he had this enormous international platform that he used. He used his fame for very responsible purposes. He used it to speak out on important moral and political issues of his day. And he did so very eloquently. He spoke eloquently against the death penalty, against the use of nuclear weapons, against state-sponsored terrorism in the USSR. And he also had a very distinctive view of the human condition that is very compelling, again, across generations. And one of the reasons for that is Camus investigates and explores and shows in many ways why we love life, why and how we persevere through difficult situations. So he had one eye on the human condition and another eye on politics. And the thing that I find so remarkable about his work is that he was able to place those on a continuum in many of his works. And you do see that signature mixture of the political and the philosophical quite clearly in The Plague. And so this is a book that was published in 1947. He wrote the bulk of it during the Nazi occupation period. And the basic conceit of this text is that a medieval bubonic plague has taken hold in an eminently modern city. So already you see the theme of the absurd. So this is a situation that we see with disbelief. We cannot believe that a medieval plague has descended on such an ordinary modern place. And in the first few paragraphs, we get a very clear sense that there's a universal quality to the city of Oran. It's a coastal city in Algeria. So the lessons that we take away from this book are going to transcend the book itself in time and space. And so the main character of the book is named Bernard Rieu. He's a doctor. He's sort of the Anthony Fauci figure of this novel. So across a very difficult backdrop, he and a sort of band of brothers are working very hard with a high degree of solidarity with one another to meaningfully and capably help each other and the citizens of Oran as best as they can to sort of transcend the futility of the moment. And all the while they do this while retaining their sense of dignity and their sense of humanity. And so they're working in a context that's difficult, not just because of the plague, but because of the social response to the plague. So there's a great deal of denial. There's some people that don't want to recognize that there's a plague. There's an insufficient response from the government. There's misinformation circulating in the city. The newspapers are only sometimes reliable, and it comes out late in the novel that they'd been obeying a censorship edict to be optimistic. There's a very prominent priest who blames the citizens of Oran, telling them that they deserve their fate. But all the while, Rieu and his colleagues, his comrades, if you will, persevere. And so Camus not only looks at so this is a model of how and why we persevere. So the why do we persevere in Camus' universe, despite the absurd, it's because we want to live. We want to to enjoy the simple pleasures of the earth, which Camus depicts in many ways as a paradise. How do we persevere despite the absurd? We rebel against the absurd. And so solidarity is one of those things. So Rieu and his comrades are rebelling against the absurd by helping their fellow citizens survive the plague. You can find by finding love, by helping others, by writing. So the writing, diagnosing and describing clearly the absurd is a form of rebelling against it, because it gives the rest of us a pathway to deal with this condition. So the plague is many things, just to sum it up. It's an allegory for the Nazi occupation. He wrote it to sort of describe a city in confinement and to see how people would respond, or depict how people would respond. It's a metaphor for the human condition. And it also sings the praises of the truth. It's a meditation on humans' capacity for strength when faced with a crisis. And Camus tells us to face this crisis with honesty and with determination and with passion. And so the text isn't without its flaws. To me, it's not his masterpiece. That would be The Stranger, in my view. And he did have some blind spots, and the book may have been overly ambitious in terms of its multiple goals, and some of that can come out in the classroom. But nonetheless, it's a novel that seeks to teach universal lessons about how to respond ethically and morally and responsibly to a catastrophe.
Well, that's a wonderful summary. And I mean, isn't it true? He wrote it, was he 28 when he wrote it? I mean, he was quite
He was a young, he was born in 13, so he wrote it in 47. So yeah.
A little bit older than that. Okay, so wonderful. Well, thank you. I mean, so this shows us a number of the themes in this novel. You know, a disease that was thought to have been abolished or thought not to apply to our modern world somehow is now part of us, right? I mean, it comes there and we see everything that, you know, that comes out in some of our world today. Now, I know, Cóilín, you too have taught this novel recently, and you've even written about it in a public forum. And I know that some of your ideas are somewhat maybe unorthodox, or you have a different take on it. I wonder if we could turn to you and see what your thoughts are.
Yeah, thanks very much, Chris, and thanks, Andrew, for the fascinating overview. I don't know if the ideas are unorthodox. They're really, in a sense, I'm not a specialist in French literature, but I am a specialist in literature. And this spring, I was teaching a class in the history of literature in English from 1800 to 2000. But when all of this took place, I thought it was time for us to read La Peste, or the plague. And part of that was because, as Chris mentioned, Andrew mentioned, the novel has found a new life in the last couple of months, not just in terms of sales and readership, but it is all over opinion columns of newspapers and magazines. It holds, if we're to believe what we read, a lot of lessons for today. So for the French philosopher Alain de Botton, writing in the New York Times recently, it's a novel that teaches us that suffering is random. Another pundit, it's a book that's finally about human goodness. Somebody else tells us, though, that the lesson of the novel is that men will always become rats again. So it's not about human goodness at all. So when my students and I read The Plague, we just couldn't come to any of these neat conclusions. This is, as Andrew suggests, a difficult novel. We found a novel that refused the shortcuts to insight that all of us seem to want to be looking for these days. And especially when I was teaching this at the end of March, so we were reading it. Some of my students were in New York City, in Queens, the heart of this outbreak, in the middle of March, reading La Peste. It's a very protean novel, and sometimes difficult. There are gruesome descriptions of widespread death. They hit a bit too close to home. There's an objective, cold narrator that seems to have no affect, gives no consolation. And then there's the lack, so Andrew mentioned that some of these problems, there's a lack of African characters in a book that is set entirely in North Africa, and a near total absence of women. These make for maddening reading. So we all felt somehow that reading it, we felt, to paraphrase the Irish poet Seamus Heaney, lost, unhappy, but at home. We, along with the citizens of Oran, we were experiencing, while reading it, the strangeness of Oran, but also of our own world. And we sensed that our bafflement and our bewilderment were not incidental to Camus' project. In fact, this appeared to be the very point of the whole novel. The narrator's insistence, Dr. Rieu, insistence throughout the novel on the ordinariness of the town of Oran. Apparently, Camus hated the city of Oran, but anyway, that this is what makes the story so poignant. It seems like an everyday city where everyday life takes place. The inhabitants of the city felt that their lives were entirely unexceptional. They weren't susceptible to spectacular disruption. Rieu, the reluctant hero of the novel, refuses to believe that something like this could happen in a town. This is a great description of DC, in a town full of, quote, obscure functionaries cultivating harmless eccentricities. So in this city, in DC and in elsewhere, we've been learning in the last few weeks and months that we live in a time and a place that can become instantly spectacular and unrecognizable. If the novel holds out any lessons at all, my students and I found, it's that this time of disruption calls us to mark properly the fundamental strangeness of the world that we live in. And I want to dwell for a minute on this idea of strangeness, because I do think it's really important. And Chris, in your opening remarks, you mentioned this. Many of our students these days are drawn to novels or music or TV shows that they like to call relatable. Camus is not relatable. This is, I think, part of the crux of the work, and this is why my students appreciate it most about the novel. It's difficult. The circumstances are almost unimaginable, but they mirror, I think, the unimaginable circumstances that we're in today. And Camus' work, like the best of literature, demands that we reach far beyond our own life experience, that we exercise that greatest and most difficult gift, imagination. What saves the city, Rieu remarks, in a curiously deflated sort of a word. He says, what saves the city is decency. But he means something that the Irish novelist Elizabeth Bowen means when she talks about the crucial importance of the exercise of the imagination on behalf of other people. Rieu calls it decency, Bowen calls it politeness. But nowadays, I think we might call it justice or equity or co-struggling. The literary critic Gayatri Spivak says that literature cultivates what she calls our imaginative capacity to enter into the lives of others. It seems a bit voyeuristic. The point is not that we should cultivate our capacity to enter into the lives of people who are somewhat like us or near us or live lives like ours. The best of the creative arts and the humanities trains us to imagine those who are not like us, who are not here, and to be ready for a world that is not derived from us and that's not laid out for us. And it trains us to do this with humility. And this is all that Camus is doing in this novel, I feel, and this is what my students, I think, understood as they were reading this and reading it with me. We learn to read, to think, to live with no expectation that we will succeed, and yet with the obligation to continue to strive. It's not easy. It demands sustained attention, careful analysis. For my students and for me, the plague brought us back to the English Romantic poet John Keats, whom we read in the course of the semester, and what he calls the negative capability of certain writers. It's a funny phrase, but I think it describes Camus perfectly. These writers, according to Keats, are capable of being in uncertainties, in mysteries, in doubts. I don't know that there's a better way to describe our world today. Yet we want to find ways out of these uncertainties, these mysteries, these doubts. We hunger, we hear every day about cures and vaccines. These are important, but maybe this is not a time just yet for prescriptions and certainty and pronouncements. We might be best served by acknowledging, as the plague helps us to do, how completely baffling this world is, and our bafflement in the face of the world, that it has been revealed to us, and to try and imagine carefully and with humility a new, and I think a better version of this world. What Camus tells us in the end is that the plague will return. Rieu says it will come back. It comes back all the time. And what we need to do is imagine a way to meet it that is marked by justice and by equity. And I think, fundamentally, I know that the humanities and literature can help us to do that, to meet these circumstances with humility, to meet these circumstances with the understanding that they are beyond us and strange to us and inassimilable to our world, but also to have been trained to meet circumstances like that. And that was the experience of reading, as a non-specialist in French, the experience of reading this novel this spring with my students.
No, that sounds very exciting. Must have been a wonderful class for the students, or at least very a way to enlarge their perspectives. it's true, right, that there is this, one of the most famous lines of the novel is the Dr. Rieu is someone is talking to him about heroism, and he says, well, there's no heroism in all of this, right? It's a matter of decency. I don't know what it means for other people, but for me, it means that I do my job. And I will say that us living in uncertainty, I've often felt this in my own role, and I'm sure other people in our audience have felt this too. We're doing things to help whatever our own projects are to go on, but we're doing it under this veil of uncertainty, where we're trying to keep things going, and we're trying to, keep imagining the lives of other people and how we can do it. And so I think, this is one of the ways that literature really can broaden our lives. And so I'd like to turn to Nicoletta Pireddu, the inaugural director of our Humanities Initiative here at Georgetown, to see Nicoletta, what's your perspective on this, on the way the humanities can work and the way literature can work to help us imagine our world differently?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Andrew, and thank you, Cóilín, for setting the tone for my attempt to zoom out, starting from Camus, precisely trying to answer these questions, what the function is of the humanities in a time of crisis, building on the interesting points that you have already raised, and I'm sure we'll be able to develop them during the question and answer period. I have to say that the COVID pandemic, as any major crisis, is a complex phenomenon that requires a comprehensive approach, not a compartmentalized one. And this is precisely what the humanities can offer. I dare say that the humanities help us understand ourselves in relation to the world. And Camus' La Peste is enlightening precisely in that respect. It is a novel about a crisis. It revolves around questions, investigations, attempts made by individuals who work together in an emergency situation despite their differences. So I think that from this novel, we can extrapolate several important points about the role of the humanities. I want to linger on 5 of them rather schematically. The first one, the humanities ask timeless questions about the human condition and the human experience in all its complexities. How do we cope with personal and collective tragedy? What are our rights? What are our duties? What do happiness and greatness mean? What does it mean to choose and be free, as we see in Camus? How can we exercise our personal freedom of choice and at the same time be respectful of the community to which we belong? The second point is that through the humanities, the past informs the present, and we also see this in Camus. Literature and other narratives have depicted pandemics since ancient times, and in these narratives we find critical observations about what it means to be in a pandemic, how these events test us, test our values, and question our familiar assumptions. Scientists have used these narratives to understand the origin of pandemics, to realize what their social and emotional impact is. And from these forms of human expressions across centuries, we can contextualize and process our traumatic experience. We can find poignant examples of courage, of endurance, an insight into what it means to be a human being as part of a species, as in Camus' The Plague. The third point that in my view is important is that the humanities foster imagination and change. And we know that imagination is a crucial term in Camus, and there is a lot to say about that. The spreading of COVID has been defined also as a crisis of the imagination. We have been unable to prevent it because we have failed to imagine, to foresee that an event of this sort might happen and how to prepare for it. We need the humanities precisely because they foster imagination as a critical tool for discovery and for change. They foster new ideas, and they also foster a language able to express these ideas, bringing differences to the fore without erasing them. When we read other stories, we undergo a transformative process. We understand that we have the capacity to change how we lead our daily life and also how we think about the world. The fourth point I want to make is that by making us aware of different modes of thinking and of living, the humanities facilitate dialogue, constructive dialogue, against discrimination and intolerance. COVID has triggered waves of xenophobia and discrimination against particular ethnic groups. Texts of different periods represent and also denounce similar episodes. For instance, I make an example, the Italian writer Alessandro Manzoni, talking about the 1630 plague epidemics in northern Italy, describes people who were persecuted because they were thought as the responsible of the plague because they allegedly were smearing it against walls. Or during the 19th century cholera epidemic throughout Europe, the adjective Asiatic or Asian and Chinese was constantly attached to the disease and also to the people and the culture connected to those areas with obvious consequences. And also the same happened for people who were then affected in Europe and then tried to migrate to the US. So we see that also during the current epidemic, something similar has happened. So the humanities can help us create a sort of immunity against the virus of hate by making us familiar with history, by telling us that something similar has happened and we can learn from those episodes, and also making us familiar with human belief systems, languages, and cultures that are different from our own. The fifth point I want to make is that COVID has exposed our vulnerability. We are biological beings subject to the laws of nature, and the humanities can respond to our need for compassion and relationships. Essentially, the humanities are shared and are to be shared. They create connections with others here and now, but also across time with previous experiences going backwards, but also with future ones, the experiences of future generations, once again through imagination. And this linkage is precisely the root of empathy. Dean Celenza was mentioning empathy to start with, and this is crucial in our current time. We grieve collectively, and this comprehensive human experience can really guide us through loss towards understanding and acceptance. So to conclude, I would say that in this pandemic, storytelling and other forms of art promote a growth in values. They make us aware of social inequities that the current pandemic has magnified. They can help us make ethical policy choices about what? About personal rights and at the same time, the public good. They also teach us that mankind needs to change and that our strength will be cooperation. But let me add one more thing before concluding. We also need not to forget that the humanities and literature in particular have an uplifting power to take us to worlds that have nothing to do with pandemics. And this is also very important for us, especially in the current time, sometimes to escape from the current tragedy and know that there is liberation and there is consolation, as Cóilín was mentioning earlier, in other worlds. So thank you, I stop here and we can continue.
Wonderful, 5 really interesting points that are very propulsive. And I want to turn to Karen Stohr now, to you, Karen, because you've done so much work, both in your publications and in your outward-facing work, to try to make some of the concerns that we've already heard, things like how do we understand our own relation to society? How do we understand our obligations to other people? And you've taken it out into the world. You've done public ethics as well. And I wonder what you've heard today makes you think of in relation to that work. I mean, I think of the great symbolism, for example, that masks have taken on, right? Are they only for us, or do we wear them for other people? Can we imagine the lives of other people strongly enough to do something that might seem inconvenient to us, but might actually help that other person, live a healthful life? So I just wonder, Karen, what strikes you about what you've heard so far, and what are your thoughts?
So thank you, Chris, and thank you to everyone for joining us. So I'm a moral philosopher, and so I want to spend the next few minutes talking about our moral choices in the current moment, including choices about masks and what's at stake in them. So the characters in Camus' novel don't seem to have a lot of choices. They are all trapped within the city walls, basically just waiting to see whether they and their loved ones are going to live or die. But this isn't the whole story, because in fact, the characters actually do make choices about how they're going to respond to this evil that has descended on the town. Are they going to just passively passively accept whatever fate befalls them, or are they going to choose to act, to fight, not just the plague itself, but also the dehumanization that accompanies it? So there's a problem known in philosophy and theology as the problem of evil. So this problem has been around about as long as the plague has, maybe not coincidentally. In its traditional form, the problem of evil is a problem about God. How can an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-loving being allow the kind of suffering that we witness all around us? And it's a really big problem. But as the novel illuminates for us, there's an additional problem that we face, which is what we are going to do about that suffering, because the problem of evil is not just God's problem, it's also our problem. So it's useful to draw a distinction between two different forms of evil, natural evil and moral evil. So natural evil includes plagues and pandemics and hurricanes and basically everything that insurance companies and airlines consider to be acts of God. Moral evil is the evil that human beings inflict on each other and sometimes also on ourselves. So now COVID-19 is pretty clearly an example of natural evil, but our pandemic has dimensions of moral evil as well. So we're witnessing racism directed at people of Chinese descent. We're witnessing disparities and vulnerability to COVID-19 that reflect ongoing injustice and inequalities in our healthcare system and our overall economic structure. So humans didn't create COVID-19, but we did create the framework of human interaction through which its damage is currently very unevenly spreading. So we're now faced with what is basically our own natural and moral plague, and it matters what we choose in response to it. This is one of the messages of Camus' novel. It matters whether we choose to withdraw from each other, hunkered down in our worlds and our bubbles and our worlds of relative privilege and safety, if we have those, or whether we choose to turn our gaze outward and embrace a suffering world. I mean, we might say that our choice is between solitude and solidarity. There's a character in Camus' novel, a foreigner, who has the opportunity to leave the city and be reunited with his beloved. This is the character of Rambert. Importantly, he's not exactly being selfish. His reason for wanting to leave is that he's desperate to maintain love and, by extension, his humanity. So, spoiler alert, he actually chooses to stay. But in staying, he doesn't sacrifice love or humanity at all. Instead, what happens is that he comes to a new understanding of what it means to act for love and to maintain his humanity in the face of the plague. So this is the fundamental moral choice that faces us. We have to figure out what it means for us to act for love and to maintain our humanity in face of the evil that's COVID-19. And then we have to act. We have to choose to take that path. So now our plague raises a bunch of specific ethical issues, both large and small, anything from international vaccine distribution to navigating one-way grocery store aisles. But in the interest of time, I'm just going to focus on one, which is the wearing of masks. So masks have suddenly taken on just tremendous cultural significance. They've become a political statement or perhaps a way of virtue signaling or maybe vice signaling. And for most of us, at least those of us who don't work in healthcare or construction, occupations where people wear masks all the time, but for those of us who don't, wearing a mask feels strange. They're physically uncomfortable, but they're also ethically uncomfortable. So what do I mean by that? In our ordinary interactions, masks get in the way of our ability to express love and concern and connection through our facial expressions. Wearing a mask feels like hiding yourself from others and not opening yourself up to them. And likewise, masks on other people can seem threatening, maybe especially when they're worn by African-American men and boys. This, by the way, is a really big ethical issue that doesn't get enough attention in the media and something we really need to think about. But all of us have to shift our thinking about what masks mean, because right now, wearing a mask is a way of expressing love for other people. My wearing a mask is how I demonstrate to you that I care about you and your health and that I take seriously my role in fighting this pandemic. But this is a huge mindset shift, and it's a pretty hard one for human beings to make, given how we're constituted. So Aristotle famously said that human beings are naturally social creatures or political animals. Social creatures don't want to wear masks and stand 6 feet apart from each other. As we know, this is really psychologically challenging. But it's also ethically challenging because we have to find a way to maintain that distance without losing our grip on our most sort of deeply human points of connection with each other. So the best public health advice right now, of course, is to stay home as much as we can, keep our distance from people, cover our faces, avoid talking and singing, and stop visiting the elderly and the sick. So morally speaking, we have to do this. This is the right thing to do. Right now, keeping our distance is what love actually requires of us. It's what it calls us to do. But we can't ignore the threats that it poses to our common humanity. So those of you who have taken philosophy courses, which for the alums is all of you, know that philosophers love to ask big questions without actually giving any answers to them. So I'm going to continue that long tradition by throwing out a few of what I think are the key moral questions that we face right now. What does it mean to choose the side of love in the midst of our own plague? How do we fight the evil that this pandemic has brought on us? Not just the natural evil of the virus, but the moral evils that we've brought on ourselves and each other. And maybe most importantly, how can we avoid losing sight of our shared humanity in what we know are going to be pretty difficult months and maybe even years ahead? So I don't have answers to these questions, but I'm really looking forward to talking with all of you about them. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Karen. Thanks to you and to all the panelists. Let me just flag some words that came up to me, and I want to try to relate them to some questions that have already come in so that we can help answer them and talk about those questions. Here are some words that occurred to me throughout everybody's conversation. The first is the word absurd. This came up, Andrew, in your in your work and your thinking on this. We also have heard the word nature. We've heard the word humility. We've heard the word humanity. And of course, we've heard the word masks. And I think that the absurd and nature have a particular kind of relevance here. The absurd, you know, for many people who haven't studied French existentialism, the absurd is a kind of a particular way of thinking about the world, right? This notion that there's not really necessarily anything about the world that is about us specifically, right? In other words, so things can happen that just seem, literally, there's no reason for them, right? And this is tangentially related, I think, to the problem of evil that Karen mentioned. And then I think there's the word nature. And Nicoletta mentioned this too, right? You know, we are part of nature, right? And so we see nature reacting and we have this immense surprise, right? We you know, all of a sudden, just like the characters in Camus' The Plague, we thought something like this just couldn't happen, and all of a sudden it did happen. And right, we've been inside for 2 months. We've had over 100,000 deaths in the United States and so on. So that induces, I think, a kind of humility, a kind of realization that we are related to nature, we're part of nature. This isn't all for us. You know, and when we treat the world like it's only an all for us, or especially when it's only an all for us as individuals, we're going to be kind of setting some imbalances in play. That relates to our humanity, right? It relates to how do we see ourselves not just as an individual human being with individual rights that we believe we have, but how do those rights relate to the rights of other people, and how can we foster other people's well-being as well as our own? Hence, finally, this word masks, which I think, as Karen suggests, is something that, you know, it does make a lot of people uncomfortable, right? I mean, it feels like you're hiding yourself. There's no accident that the Latin word for mask is persona, right? And we often talk about people taking on this or that persona, right? It's an ancient theatrical word, right? It was the mask that you'd wear in a theater. And so we feel that we're somehow hiding ourselves, and some people feel that their own individuality is being stifled when they wear this. And hence also when there are people from already marginalized groups doing something that seems out of the ordinary, like wearing a mask, that can even increase the prejudice against members of those underrepresented groups, as I think Karen alluded to. So all of those things are there in your comments, and I thank you for them. And I want to relate them to some of the questions that are coming in now. The first is from one of our colleagues, Olga Mersin, and it's a long question, but the question that she has relates to the secularism, what she calls the secularism that's present in the work of Camus. And I think that's related to all of those things we discussed, right? Because if on the one hand, right, the world was made for us, you know, and we're part of a divine social economy, right, where the world was made for us and we have a special place in that world. Whereas on the other hand, you could say that we're also part of the world. So how do we relate to this? You know, how do we think about, you know, Camus and the secular, and how do we position ourselves in those relations today? I wonder, does anybody want to take a crack at that? This Go ahead, Andrew. Yeah, you've dealt with this.
Yeah, so I mean, it's interesting. I'd never thought of Camus as a secular writer. I tend to think of him in, it's a little bit even harsher than the word secular. I would say it's even more, it's atheistic in that he outright rejects, and sometimes violently so, depending on the book, the religious solution to the problem of the absurd. Mm-hmm. And so Camus sees destiny as an affair that it's a human affair, and one that must be resolved by and among human beings. Mm-hmm. And I think that it's an interesting question. It's fascinating to think of it that way, especially when you think about it in the context of the ways in which, at least in the 20th century and beyond, the notion, the way the French think of laïcité, this sort of, it's not quite separation of church and state, it's not quite secularism, but it's this way of separating the religious from other elements of life. So, but it's, I mean, if you think about the way things go in terms of the plot, in terms of both the stranger and the plague, I mean, Morceau in The Stranger literally throws the priest out of his jail cell. So there's a rejection of religion that's quite physical and overt. So it's a very pertinent question.
Any others want to take a crack? Karen, yeah, you look like you're.
Yeah, so I mean, I think this is a really fascinating question, both sort of in the sort of theoretical, like a question about Camus, but also just a question about the capacities of religious faith to sort of help us through the challenges of life. I mean, you see this tension obviously in a lot of different kinds of works. You mentioned Dostoevsky, it certainly shows up in the Brothers Karamazov, but it also even just shows up in a lot of religious contexts for religious practice. Here I'm thinking about Mother Teresa's letters that express, you know, sort of her despair, right? And her feeling of sort of the lack of, in her words, the lack of God's presence, which the Ignatian tradition calls desolation, right? This feeling of kind of like emptiness or the absence of God or faith. And for many people, that's a real practical concern. You know, for many people, crisis, death, tragedy really shake the faith that they have. And so I think there's bigger questions here, not just sort of about the secularism, about the work, but about the extent to which religion and religious practice, the way in which it can help us or fail to help us cope with crisis and tragedy. That's an incredibly important question. So I think even like sort of throwing out the secularism as something, you know, in this context in which Camus is writing, you know, is it any surprise that people would be led to this view and this kind of despair? And then what, if any, answers does religion have for that? Which I think is a fantastically important question.
Very important. And I would say, Karen, just to you know, add a little bit to what you said, I think in the time that we're in now, you know, we know that there are at least two sides to religion, right? There are theological beliefs, there are matters of private faith that people have, but there's also the way of people aggregating, right, in ceremonies and churches and so on. And that's been something that for the most part has not been allowed to people, right? So that kind of public practice of their religion has been taken away during this time as well. So I think people have had to try to find new ways to exercise their religious faith, you know, to think about this. I wonder if other panelists want to take a crack at this idea of secularism and Camus. Or
I just want to jump in, connecting secularism as let's say, lack of religious support. And we know that the figure of the priest is a very controversial one. Andrew mentioned his first homily, the priest's first homily, and then in front of the death of a child, which is really another instance of absurd. He tries to find probably a more humane way of explaining the reference points that religion could offer, but it's an either or, either you take everything or you reject everything. So there is no middle ground. And I think that within this middle ground, we find the human dimension. I'm thinking of the character of Tarou, with whom it is always good to talk because he's empathetic, because he's a man, so he's a human being. And going back to hopelessness, there's a passage that really struck me, the idea that being used to hopelessness is even worse than being hopeless. And so there implicitly there is an invitation to fight, to continue fighting against this absurd instead of yielding to this lack of future, lack of possibility. So I see Camus obviously as a very controversial figure, but still clinging to a human dimension that can perhaps replace, with all its limitations and weaknesses, the religious level, which is obviously not viable in his world. And in the plague, there are a lot of local attempts to create communities. There is no hope without memory at a certain point, the narrator says. And so also the idea of going back to past events and see that they're also part of this trajectory in which we belong. Or those empathetic moments when the two characters, Rieu and his colleague, go swimming, you know, those moments when, you know, the emotions, even of the body, are a way of bonding, of moving technically people to act. So this is where I find some light in Camus' world.
Yeah, I see. Cóilín, why don't you weigh in since you haven't yet?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. I might broaden it out a little bit beyond beyond the novel. I'm looking at other questions as well. When I think of the word secular, I think of the critic Edward Said, who talks about secular criticism. It has very little to do with God, but it has a lot to do with a sort of a constant, corrosive, purposely corrosive questioning of all of the assumptions that we hold dear. And at a moment like this, I think what we see at a moment like this is that one of the things that's rearing its head is nationalism. As we close borders, as we think about xenophobia, as we look at counting of numbers of those who've become infected, those who have passed away in borders, as we think about the way that we are being constricted by necessity, is that one of the things that's sort of rearing its ugly head in the time of COVID is nationalism and xenophobia. And I think back to this kind of constant Edward Said's idea of the humanities as being the constant work of undermining and questioning and rethinking all of those things that we hold dear, that we have become accustomed to. And so it's a different kind of a secularism, but it's built on the same secularism. And I think this is something we have to hold on to right now in this moment.
But would you also say that it can be a double-edged sword a little bit? In other words, the spirit of only questioning cherished beliefs versus, do you know what I mean? Is that I'm thinking of, there's work, for example, a literary critic at the University of Virginia, Rita Felsky, who's written about the importance of mood and affect and making sure that we remember to be moved by literature rather than only dissecting it. Because part of, I think, what makes literature speak to people in the world, and you know, there have been a few questions that have come in about the function of the humanities. You know, what are the humanities for? You know, how can we get people to read more work in the humanities? How do we encourage people to read a work that may indeed be difficult, like Camus? It seems to me, wouldn't you agree, Cóilín, that there's a kind of dynamic there, that on the one hand, there's that critical impulse to classify and to deconstruct and so on, but there must also be this impulse to recognize the emotions one have to give into them, as it were, and not to think that that's somehow a betrayal of one's critical function.
Yes, I think we need to find ourselves, in a sense, on the horns of that dilemma.
Yeah.
To realize the pleasure, the consolation, the love, the reason that we're all here is because we read, we look at art, we listen to music. But we're all here. We're also here because we know that reading and looking at art and listening to music gives us critical capacities and trains us in both empathy and also in criticism, in a sense.
Yes. Andrew, did you want to weigh in? I know you had your hand up for a second.
Yeah, I just wanted to add a quick thing to what Nicoletta had said. It just jogged a specific memory about the way Camus didn't, and this also relates to Olga's question, he didn't want to create sort of a systematic philosophy. He didn't want to have one system replace another. So in other words, he didn't want his thought to be sort of a closed system that would replace effectively religion. And it's one of the reasons he rejected Marxism. And it's also one of these reasons why, even after having read him for years and years and years, you still need to constantly seek answers within each one of his books and each one of his essays, each one of his speeches. And it's always a little bit, there's often very subtle differences because he himself was still seeking. So you see the process. He was not a systematic philosopher in any way, in the way that Sartre was, at least for a good chunk of his long career. And so it's another way of rejecting systematization. So that's it.
In other words, a recognition of change. It's the classic problem of essence versus existence, right?
Exactly.
Or systematicity versus living in the world and changing with the new things you you bring it. Let me ask you all another question that's inspired by one of the questions that we got from one of our audience members named Lisa. You know, she asks, what's the role of the humanities when it comes to, let me change the wording of her question and say, what is the role of the humanities in how we read the world? And what I mean by this is, I think that, you know, many of the problems we face at their root are problems of reading. How do we read the world, right? We have all of these data coming in about all these different topics, some of them controversial, some of them from different ideological or political camps. What's the role of the humanities in sifting all of that? Lisa asks about disinformation, right? Because we know there's disinformation around the coronavirus. There are conspiracy theories and so on, but we know that there are conspiracy theories in other realms of life too, and there's disinformation in other realms of life too. So if on the one hand, we recognize the great complexity that literature brings us and allows us with the other branches of the humanities, history, philosophy, and so on, to interpret our world in all of its complexity, what recommendations do you all have to our audience? How do you sift through those things? How do you sift through these waves of information? Yeah, go ahead, Cóilín.
That's a great question, and I've been thinking about it a lot because I've actually been writing something a little bit about how literature and the sciences can work together. So I want to ask you a question by maybe referring also to a question by Louis, who asks, what do we mean by humanities? So far our discussion has been about literature. And so I might give an example of something that's been going on for a long time. We think about the HIV/AIDS epidemic in Southern Africa. This has been devastating. And it took until the mid-2000s for a concerted effort across historians, anthropologists, sociolinguists, writers, to think about the fact that this is a pandemic that has both pathogens and people involved. And that we know that the way that you know, vaccines are good, vaccines are important, but that we also need to think about human behavior, and not just human behavior in terms of listening to this advice or that advice, but how we take responsibility in the way that Karen has talked about, the way that we take responsibility. And I think the humanities, in a much broader sense than just literature, are about the very question of how we too are actors in a pandemic, and how we too can tell stories and listen to each other, and to learn across all of these disciplines. So it's a sort of, if we could look to Southern Africa as an example of a place that the humanities have become central to trying to solve the problem of a pandemic.
Interesting. Karen, did you have a reaction to that? I thought I saw you were.
Yeah, well, reactions to everything. Yeah, I think, so I say this as someone whose specialty is definitely not literature. And, you know, the question about what the humanities have to offer, I think, is really important, because part of, you know, what our aim should be is to try to communicate the avenues through which humanities can contribute to our greater understanding of problems. I mean, I think we all recognize that we desperately need scientific answers to a lot of questions right now, but not all of our questions are scientific ones. There's a lot more out there. And then, you know, where do we turn for that? And I think one of the things that is sometimes challenging is to sort of convince people in some ways that humanities are a place to turn, whether it's literature, or philosophy, or theology, or history, or art, or music, and to sort of try to articulate what value there is, or what can be found there. And I think one of the challenges that faces a lot of us, certainly in philosophy, is that we sometimes create more confusion for people, and this people can find really frustrating. Certainly students do. Like, they hate the fact that philosophy takes stuff they thought was simple and then makes it really complicated. You might say, well, it actually is complicated. And so some of that is also helping people become in a mindset, get into a mindset where they can be receptive to the kinds of lessons that the humanities has to teach all of us. And I think that's a challenge for us, because we live in a world that really prioritizes certain forms of inquiry and certain ways of approaching problems, and can sometimes want to be like, I don't want to hear about this stuff, it's all just a matter of opinion, or it's all just fluffy stuff. And so I think it's really important that we be able to articulate the limits of those kinds of answers while still acknowledging their importance, but also positively articulate what it is that the humanities can offer in these tremendously disconcerting, absurd moments.
Yeah, no, that's excellent. Nicoletta, I see that. Did you want to say something? Yeah.
Thank you for the exhaustive feedback that you have already given. The thing I could add is it's also a matter of quantity. In the humanities, we read a lot, and we read not only the lines, but also through the lines. So trying to sift through the amount of information that bombards us also means patience, also means slow pace, trying to compare, read from different perspectives, different genres, and give up the hope of univocal answers. Many of us have already mentioned that sometimes the questions, as Karen was saying, are difficult. There isn't a univocal answer, there are no answers, but questions sometimes help us more than answers. And so they really open up worlds. So to go back to the question, which seemed also a kind of practical question, how do we cope with this amount of information? I think the humanities allow us, it's also a matter of humility, to understand that the more we read, the less we know. So it's always a road and no light at the end of the tunnel maybe, but through the process, we enrich ourselves and we become more sophisticated readers. So I don't think there is an end to this process, but we have to continue absorbing information and exerting our critical abilities.
Maybe one more, because I see we're coming up against time and I want to be respectful from people's time. So Andrew, do you want to have a...
I was going to just chime in and say, and I agree with what all my colleagues said. And I think one thing that can get lost with the humanities and literature and all the various interpretations that we tend to do is that there is still such a thing as what a fact is, a cold hard fact. And part of what we do is that, I think, again, like Nicoletta said, with the volume of reading we do, we need to be able to teach our students what a reliable source is, how a reliable source may or may not deal with a fact or fiction or an opinion, and the difference between the two, and to respect factuality. And I spent a lot of time I wrote a book on Stalinism in France, and I spent a great deal of time analyzing the mechanics and the techniques of propaganda. So another thing that we can do, why narrative is so important, because narrative shapes so much of our perception of politics, and people in politics deliberately shape narrative. And so it's important to be able to understand what is factual therein, what is discourse, so story versus discourse. This is an old story in the study of literature. So the difference between the two, what is a fact and what is the interpretation thereof around it.
Yeah, I know. I mean, these are great insights, and I think we have a lot of work to do in the humanities, because on the one hand, I think we have to keep respecting the complexity both of the works we study and the world that we're in, but we also have to respect the need that the world has for people to take action, right, and to do things and to base the decisions they make on what you call facts, Andrew, right, on things. So we have to find ways of consensus that might not always be thoroughly provable, but that have enough consensus behind them that we develop trust again. If you think of the problem of climate change, right, I always say that this is a problem really not so much a science problem anymore, but a humanities problem, a reading problem. If 99.9% of climate scientists say that human activity is in some ways influencing the global climate, we should be able to form circles of trust around that, even if there are some disagreements around the edges, right? And I think this is going to be the work that we're going to have to do in the humanities, those of us who are scholars of the humanities, is making sure we do both of those things. We make things complex, but we also make things clear, and we respect the context that we're in. And I just think that I'm so thankful to all four of you for being here and helping us do some of that work today in this panel. I hope, to the audience out there, I hope that this was stimulating to you. I hope that this was enjoyable to you. I hope this gives you a renewed enthusiasm. There were many great questions that we couldn't get to. People mentioned other works of Camus, like The Myth of Sisyphus, the tormented figure who had to keep pushing a rock up, and so on, and how that relates. I hope you read Camus, but I hope you read other novels and other works of philosophy and works of history and look at works of art, all of these things that can enrich us in this difficult time. I'm so proud that our colleagues from Georgetown College were here at Georgetown University. Thank you again to all of you, and thanks to the audience for being here for this stimulating discussion. I wish everybody a great and wonderful evening.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.